as I introduce our panel for the third time, we have had a great day so far. We've talked about why it's important to do a narrative, what makes a good narrative. We talk about it from a billing perspective. We've talked about it from a legal perspective. We've talked about it from a reimbursement and billing and so forth. And today you have on the workshop webinar team, we've amassed over nearly 100 years of combined experience. I myself have 0, but the panel is filled with experience. So I'm going to introduce our first panelist, Phil Sanderson. Phil, if you want to stand up. And
Sure.
Phil has been amazing this morning. He comes and we won't hold it against him. Like I said, we're in St. Louis, Missouri, home of the Blues. He's driven from Nashville, Tennessee, home of the Predators. But Phil has over 25 years of experience in the EMS world, in the healthcare world, and is the general sales manager of NarrativePRO. Welcome, Phil, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Do you want to give a little bit of background?
Sure, yeah. So we've been excited here today. We've talked about the basics of documentation, then we talked about the reimbursement, and now we're going to move into some of the basic legal aspects of your document. And then also stay tuned after this because we're going to do an informative demonstration of NarrativePRO. So I do come with 27 years of industry knowledge, being in EMS and also in healthcare in general, starting off in the field, moving into training, and then into the administration of EMS. And I got to tell you, I've seen documentation in my time move from, just taking care of the patient to now taking care of the patient, taking care of the medical record, and then trying to make sure that we get paid for what we're doing. So look forward to wrapping this up today.
Wonderful. And we're a team up here. Phil has reminded me that you will not want to miss the demonstration of NarrativePRO. We're going to do that after this presentation. So come back or stay tuned for that demonstration of NarrativePRO. Lynn Thompson's our other panelist, comes from A&B Billing.
Come on up.
He didn't want to stand up, but we're trying to make this as interactive as possible. So Lynn has over 29 years of experience in the EMS world, and from a billing perspective has shed a great light on third-party billing as well as the pros and cons of narrative writing solutions.
Okay.
Give us a little background.
Well, appreciate you having us here today, Josh, and I really enjoy it. I do have 29, actually over 39 years of experience in fire and EMS, so don't be cutting me short there, okay? I need all of them. I burned them. But I've also been from the very ground up as an ambulance driver, EMT, paramedic, 25 years of Memphis Fire as a firefighter, paramedic, lieutenant, EMS training, kind of all aspects of it. And also as an RN, so seeing it from the other side of the fence with that too as well. So I just wanted to be a part of this day to share my experiences and my knowledge to help our clients, your clients, do a better job at what we're trying to help them with, and that's write a better narrative.
That's awesome. And Lynn was in the previous 2 webinars, which we will post for people who missed it, gave some great examples from the billing perspective of what would get approved, what wouldn't get approved. Both Lynn and Phil gave some tips and tricks to how to maintain compliance and so forth. So you'll want to watch those as well. So without further ado, we want to dive into our third webinar presentation. Phil, you're going to take over from here.
Yeah, so, I think we've all heard the old saying, you reap what you sow. Well, the same perspective and principle comes into your medical record and your documentation. So kind of changing up the phrase a little bit, you reap what you write. And as we've talked about in the previous 2 presentations, spelling, grammar, the factual information, things that are true fact, not your opinion, definitely will come back to haunt you should you ever get caught up into a legal case. So you definitely want to make sure that what you write or what you type on your EPCR is what you meant. And you definitely need to make sure before you submit it that you rewrite it or review it, excuse me. So we're going to kind of talk a little bit about this, and we've probably all heard the old saying, if it wasn't documented, it wasn't done. Now, there may be a little bit of gray in that statement when you get into the courtroom, but for all practical purposes, when a case is going into the court, there is a process that takes place. And typically, they're going to allow someone that is of equal training to review it. And I've done some of these in my previous. And, you know, while I may know what the person might meant, you know, you can't really assume that. So I'll give you a perfect example. One of the cases that I was a subject matter expert on some years ago, the paramedic picked up a patient and he did vital signs. Well, you know, having my industry knowledge, because this was a transport to another hospital and, you know, things didn't go so well, I immediately flipped over to the transfer form and I found the same vital signs that he initially took when he encountered the initial assessment documented on the second care report going to the other hospital. That was a red flag. That threw up a huge red flag for me. So, you know, you might say, well, what about that? Well, the same vital signs, 2 separate times, hours apart, not likely. Maybe close, but not likely. So the little things like that are a big factor. And then also too, in other cases that I've had a chance to look at, you know, somebody says, well, we did this. Okay, well, I don't see it here in the medical record. And so as a subject matter expert, when I've had a chance to do that, then, you know, my job is to report back to the attorney what my findings are, and then they take it forth and either settle it out of court or take it into court. And if it goes into court, you've got a group of people who are probably not familiar with medical terms and not familiar with what things, you know, are between the lines. So it's very important that, you know, you document everything and it's very clear and concise. So, as I just said, you know, to the jury, the medical record could be very confusing and foreign to them and somewhat intimidating. So, again, to be very clear. All right, a jury may not understand what you mean, and therefore, you know, a different story is told. And we, you know, we could probably sit here for, you know, half a day and talk about, you know, some examples of that. And I'm sure from the billing perspective, you know, Lynn's probably encountered some of those as well. You know, their opinions, you know, they basically come from the evidence that is presented to them, which is clearly the medical record. So, some errors that may cost you: use of abbreviations. I like to point this one out because as EMS professionals, we're very bad about just kind of making up some of our own terms and our own abbreviations, and we talked about this earlier in the documentation presentation. So you need to make sure that if your service or you are an individual who likes to use abbreviations in your documentation, that they are approved. And what I would highly recommend is that your organization or your local service put together a use of approved abbreviations that you as a group uniformly use, and keep those on file and make sure that they are, you know, legit. You know, we could make up a whole bunch of them, but there are a lot of medical dictionaries out there and a lot of medical abbreviations that are already out there. Some of them actually mean different things. They may be the same thing. So that's another reason why you should have a approved in your service. Keep those on file. Keep those, you know, readily available, that should a patient care report go to court, that the attorney or the subject matter experts can call upon your leadership or whoever your compliance officer is. You can pull that up and it clearly defines what that abbreviation is. And it's also very important for, you know, billing aspects too.
Yes.
And then also too, this is another one, frustration charting. And, you know, having been in the industry for over 27 years and Lynn's been in it for over 39 years, we got into the industry because we wanted to take care of our community. You know, some of us and some of the folks in the audience here probably grew up in some of the small rural areas, or maybe it was a large metropolitan, but you have a connection with the folks there. You may even have family member, your mother, your father, your grandparents, whomever. And so you get into this because it's a really, rewarding field and you want to take care of your patients. And then sometimes there's things that happen to us in our day-to-day that we don't like. We get a call that's frustrating to us, or maybe it's a patient that we've transported, many times this week. And quite honestly, that really doesn't matter, because we're here for a purpose and we're here to take care of whoever calls us. But, we are human, and often we want to translate that or transpose that into our narrative, and it becomes a point of frustration. You can read those. If you, Josh, you said you don't have any knowledge, but if you're reading something, you can clearly define, hey, this sounds like this clinician was frustrated. Doesn't sound very factual to me. So it starts to tell a different story and leave a different impression, because remember, first impressions are extremely important.
And Phil, I want to share this with our audience to make it as interactive as possible. Please submit your questions on things. Phil, you're hitting on a question for me right off the bat with this. We know that there's legality and there's cover your ass with the need to document. We know that there's reimbursement, but the quality of care gets lost in why we need to document. And I have zero paramedic experience. I have a wife that's a physician who does charting, and it's one of her least favorite parts of the job. But hit home hard why charting or writing a narrative, documenting, is actually an important process to elevated care.
Well, it really boils down to continuity of care. And, if someone here in the audience or here today were to fall on the floor, there's a reason why they fell. So we need to document our assessment, our findings, and then whenever we get them to the hospital, the ER staff, is going to want to know what happened. So there needs to be a continuity of care, and it really becomes kind of a track record, if you want to call it that, because if it was for some random reason why this person fell, the doctor or whoever the team is in the hospital is going to want to look back and say, okay, this is what's happened. This is what's happened. Here's all the pieces of the puzzle. Here's the evidence. Oh, wait a minute. It looks like, based on the evidence that happened prior to the arrival of the hospital, and now we're getting lab work, now we're doing these tests, all these things are coming together. This person may have this type of disease. And in many cases, not having that initial report documented appropriately from the ambulance staff may leave something very important out, because we are the eyes and the ears of what happens prior to getting to the hospital. So extremely important for continuity of care. All right, and then another thing too is finger pointing. It's really sad to say that we have clinicians or PMTs and paramedics that do this in their charting, and I got to tell you, whenever this is looked at from a legal perspective, it's very obvious, and it calls question. So we definitely got to be careful of that. So beyond reimbursement, why is it important to document for legal aspects? Well, it's real simple, because bad documentation, leaves us jobless from lawsuits. And, we didn't get into this because we want to get caught up into lawsuits. And from a liability standpoint, your service, your agency, they have liability insurance, and it's covered, to a certain amount, but there's a cost to that. And, and there's also some caps too. But, the last thing you want to do is for someone to lose their certification or their license or a service to be really hit hard financially just because of something that wasn't documented appropriately. Because in all reality, I don't feel like that any one of us, any of the professionals out in the audience, do these things on purpose. It's just sometimes this is what we get caught up in. So you got to be careful with that.
Okay, and here's a question along these lines for Lynn. Lynn, do you see, in being a third-party billing company, do you see a relationship to improved reimbursement rates to the quality of care? Are you able to see that?
Oh, absolutely, as long as you document it. Because you can be the greatest, clinician in the world, but if you don't have it written in a documentation that can be read readily by other medical personnel or legal, whatever the issue may be, it doesn't show. So yes, you have to document what you do.
Because I think so many paramedics out there feel that the level of care they provide is independent of their documentation. I'm the best dang paramedic out there. I don't document very well. But that you guys both are testimonials of that's not true.
Right.
It's not.
Yeah. And if you want to take it to a kind of a different spin, that's a good point there. There are a lot of good paramedics out there, a lot of good EMTs out there that don't document well. And, that doesn't really tell the reflection upon them. I mean, it tells the reflection on their hands-on, but why not go ahead and put it in your documentation so it's a well-rounded machine, so to speak. So that's a good point. So definitely you need to inspect your ticket, inspect your narrative, inspect your EPCR, whatever your terminology is. It needs to be clinically relevant information. Sometimes our EMTs and paramedics want to put things in they're not clinically relevant. And, if it has a relationship to the situation, the call, the scene, the pre-arrivals, all the sample history, then it's relevant. But if it's just something totally not, don't put it in there. It's not necessary. All right, and then there again, be very factual. Never jump to conclusions. And also too, if you have to alter your medical record, there is a really precise way to do that. Now, if you're still on your paper tickets, definitely need to use the old, draw a line through, initial, and then make note of that, okay? You never want to be, tearing up a paper ticket, throw it in the trash. That looks really bad. And then if you have to do addendums, you need to note that this is an addendum. You don't need to be deleting things that you've already written in your EPCR. So your service should have a compliance program that outlines that. And then this is something that we kind of hit on earlier this morning in our first part of the webinar, is it comes down to this, and it really, first impressions, legibility. And, now with our EPCRs, legibility is not necessarily a problem, but you can definitely read into sloppy. So, like we said earlier, sloppy records tells a sloppy story. And make sure dates and times. I hit on an example of that earlier where, if you take a set of vital signs at this time, you need to take another set of vital signs when you see them again, but, make sure those dates and times are correct. And then if you've got the patient, sometimes you transport patients twice in the same day, make sure that you're using the appropriate dates and times for that too. And then also too, document consents, refusals, oral and written written orders. You can never document too much. And, sometimes you'll have to, get a physician on the radio or the phone. It may not be in your standing order protocol. You'll have to ask special permission for something. It's really, I strongly suggest that when you get to the hospital, you find that physician or you find that nurse or whoever is in charge and whoever gave that order, and find a place in your narrative or on your EPCR that allows for them to sign, next to that order. Because, they have a lot of patients too, so they may not remember, and definitely document exactly how it was given and how it was received. All right, now refusals are really kind of a big touchy subject in the industry. And unfortunately, we do have some professionals that would probably prefer to not transport someone than they would to transport them. But quite honestly, that is a huge, huge liability on them and the agency they work for. So when you're out there and you're transporting or you're going to a patient that may refuse transport, and there are a lot of reasons why this could happen, you need to make sure that the patient clearly understands why he or she. You need to tell them what is the worst case scenario that they could encounter by not going to the hospital. And you know, it's real simple. They could die. So, so if you talk to the patient who's been in a car accident, or maybe they experience chest pain, or maybe they've fallen, or whatever it is, and you go through all the risk factors, and then you explain that to them, and you say, okay, now you understand if you don't go to the hospital with me, that you could die. You could die. And if they clearly understand that, then, you know, perhaps maybe, you know, you've got a good form of communication. But you need to ask them to repeat these indications back to you, because sometimes we have, and I think it's in one of the upcoming slides, we have language barriers. We have, you know, people who don't clearly understand, you know, mentally, or other things could be going on that they may not really understand what you're saying. Anything you want to add to that?
No, other than that, you're right. Refusals are a very big minefield for EMS providers, because while, you know, there are patients that do want to refuse, most of the time we can cover that by explaining to them in detail why they need to follow up. Because if something happens and if it's not clearly documented, they're going to be after you. The lawyer's going to come after you because you were the last medical person to speak to them. So refusals are serious business, and we need to make sure that we have a strong documentation within our narrative explaining what happened.
Yeah, you know, and there's several scenarios that are pretty common, and one of the ones that perhaps may be very common is folks who are in car accidents. Sometimes, you know, they decide they don't want to go to the hospital because they're not hurt or injured in their mind at that point in time, but later on in the night or the days to come, they have injuries that have not been taken care of, and it causes serious problems. So we definitely need to be informing them about the mechanism of injury and get very detailed with them and help them understand. And certainly we're not trying to do any scare tactics, you know, by no means is that what I'm saying, but you know, but our general public who are not trained as professionals, they don't understand some of these internal things that could occur. You could have bleeds that may not show up right now, and a couple of days down the road, they could wake up and you know, have a serious bleed or not wake up at all. And then, you know, diabetics are a very common refusal out there, and a lot of times the EMT or paramedic will go into the home. They will treat the diabetic patient. They will be unconscious. They'll give them some medication. The diabetic patient will come back alert, and then they're like, oh, I don't want to go because you fixed me, you rescued me. Well, the point of that is this: if the diabetic doesn't get up and start eating to sustain the blood sugar, then that medicine that they gave them is going to wear off and they're going to be right back where they came. And then sometimes, you know, some of our partners in law enforcement will take patients to the jail, and they'll be a diabetic, and when they really got a head injury. So there's just a lot of things that really go into play here, and sometimes we don't give it the full, you know, credibility that we should. So just a couple of rules. These are not all inclusive. Your service should have its own policy, and you should review those with your administration or your legal team. So does the patient have the ability to understand that they are affected? You know, you need to find out. By substance abuse, you know, we have a lot of things going on out there in terms of substance abuse. We have language barriers, and then also too, we have just simply illnesses or injuries like I just described. So you must explain your issues like we just talked about, and then have that patient repeat it back to you so that you can get a clear understanding. And also too, in your document that the patient repeated back and what they repeated back, and put that in quotation marks. All right, so you need to make sure that when you're doing refusals that you do a full assessment, you do a sample history, you do vital signs. Now, you know, somebody in the audience may say, well, if the patient says, you know, I'm refusing, don't touch me, well, I get that. And certainly you can't, you know, kidnap them or do any harm to them, and there's laws against that. So if that be the case, then you're going to need to document that. And there may be some cases where you might need to have law enforcement involved to also, verify some of these things. All right. But obtain a signature from a witness. Whether it be a family member, would it be a law enforcement person, somebody on the scene that witnessed you, talking to the patient, trying to get them to go to the hospital, explain all the risk factors, and the patient says, no, I don't want to go, and get them to sign. And then also document the patient's explanation for refusing. Why is it you don't want to go? I just told you these are all the worst cases that can happen. You could die from this. And find out what they say, add that to your document. So consider the risks. And I say this to EMTs and paramedics that often maybe don't want to transport the patient for various reasons. We get tired, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, we ran many calls. We've all been there. But really and truly, you're putting yourself and your service at a very, very high risk, and not to mention the patient. And quite honestly, if you think about it for a split moment, if you do this right, if you transport the patient and you document accordingly, you've probably done that in less time, and you've probably gotten back to your quarters, and you've probably gone back to bed, or whatever it is that you were doing, than if you were doing all of these things, preventive measures, and document it, then, if you just take them to the hospital. So as we talked about, be careful what you write. If the patient's status changes, document the ongoing assessment. And truthfully, like Lynn said earlier in the reimbursement section, you need to be documenting, 2 sets of vital signs. Well, you need to document, your primary and your secondary assessment. And that's one of the really nice features of NarrativePRO, because it actually has a feature in the platform that allows you to do that, and it speaks to that, and it's prompting you to do that, and it's very easy for you to do that. And another thing that often, our EMTs and paramedics like to do, especially if it's a familiar patient, is we can wrap this ticket up right quick and kind of relax for a moment on the way to the hospital, do our observation. But, anything can happen along the way. And certainly, it's really not a good idea to finish up your documentation before you turn over care to the ED, because what happens in many cases is you've transported Miss Jones, you know her personally, you transport her 3 times a week, and so you do your documentation, and before you really ever get out of her driveway, you've already turned her over to the caregiver, when in fact you've not even left the driveway. Well, what could happen, and probably happens more often than we know, is that Miss Jones may deteriorate between point A and point B. Now you've completed your documentation, and you've got to do some backing up. You got to do some addendums, because you shouldn't be trying to alter that. So, just work it each call by call. So, just kind of reinforcing things that we've talked about throughout the day. Documentation is the best way to keep you out of courts. You want to be able to document so that you can understand 10 years down the road, and then also to document accordingly for your reimbursements. And as we said, the medical record, the continuity of care, all of those things are equally as important. You want to maintain your license or certifications. I don't know about you guys, but quite honestly, I don't ever want to go through that again. All right, I keep up my CEUs, and I have typically 4 times as much as I need, because I don't want to have to take that test again. Right? I don't know about you, Lynn.
No, don't want to repeat it in any way.
Not at all. Not at all. And then, of course, just good practice from fraud and abuse, and then to defend yourself. And that's what it's all about: defend yourself. Best practices for the medical record, and again, reimbursement. And I hate to keep harping on that, but it's really about patient care, and it's really about getting paid. So document everything that's factual. You don't want to document things that are just opinionated. You don't want to finger point. You don't want to insert frustration, but you want to document everything that is from the time you're getting the call to the time you're dropping them off. but you want to take that one step back. When you get to the call and you investigate the prior arrivals, you want to put those things in there as well. If you have quotes, put them in quotations. You know, if the patient says, I fell yesterday and I got back up and today I fell again, put those in quotations so that it identifies that. And then also too, you know, be very descriptive, chart the facts and what you see, what you touch, and what you smell. And just kind of reinforcing again, there are some folks in the audience that don't have the electronics. If you are still using the paper and you have to draw a line through things, draw just a simple line, write your initials above it, and then you can move forward. And avoid those personal opinions. All right. What happens if you get? You lose every time. So, Josh, I'm not sure
Yep. So where I want to go is, you just gave a great overview of the do's and some of the don'ts on documentation. And there appears to be three main parts. There's the legality, there's the reimbursement, and there's the continuity of care. If we could take one at a time, and let's start with the reimbursements. What are the common mistakes that paramedics are making and EMTs to cost reimbursements?
The biggest thing I see when I'm reviewing the PCRs is they're just not telling the story. It's really that simple. And as we talked about here today, you have to tell the whole story, because that's in the narrative is where the billing processors are seeing it to push this forward to get it reimbursed. So they need the information of why do we need an ambulance and why do we need a stretcher, and it needs to be in that narrative. So learn to tell the story.
And from a legality perspective, what mistakes are paramedics making that they're just not covering themselves well on a legality perspective?
Well, it really follows suit with what Lynn said. They're not telling the story. They're not telling the factual information, or they're inserting their own opinion, and it's frustration, and you know, it's fatigue, you know, because, you know, EMTs and paramedics typically work a lot of long hours, and that just shows up in their writing. And from when that goes into a you know, legal perspective, you know, I got to tell you, the attorney that's trying to gain the most eats that alive. So you just got to keep it clean. You got to keep it concise and tell the story and tell it factual and not just in your own opinion.
And from a continuity of care and best care?
Same thing. Same thing.
Because when you hand that patient off from the field to the ED and even up through their whole care, extended care, you need to have all the story together, and that's the first part of the story. So tell it so it can continue throughout their care.
Great. So what we're going to do now, we're going to take about a 10 to 15 minute break so that we can prepare a demonstration of the NarrativePRO software and get to all the questions, kind of a daily recap. So it's going to, our final hour is going to be a demonstration of NarrativePRO software combined with a Q&A coverage of the entire day. So we're going to take a 10-minute break from the stream. We'll be back in 15 minutes. And we'll hope, if you're joining us now, we hope you can stick around, and we have people that are signed up for the next hour. Thank you very much.